Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presented by ActiveNav and MC Bernstein Data. It is time to dump the junk. We're excited for a great conversation about deleting data. Andy, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Marissa. My name is Andy Seaman. I'm a senior account exec here at ActiveNav. We're a data privacy and governance software company and experts in the provision of software solutions to help organizations discover, understand, classify, and act on their data. I have over 25 years experience helping customers benefit from the deployment of enterprise software and data management solutions, always focused on improving their business operations. And yeah, I'm really pleased to be here today with you. As Marissa noted, I'm joined by Matthew Bernstein and Lynn Molfetta from MC Bernstein Data. Lynn, Matthew, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Lynn Molfetta, and I am sorry, I'm trying to get my video on. Finally, I'm on. Hello, everybody. I'm Lynn Molfetta, and I am a co-partner and information governance strategist at MC Bernstein Data, and I help companies get control over their data and put good governance and controls on their information. Prior to that, I was at Deutsche Bank as well as Citibank, and I ran their global records management programs.
Thank you, Lynn. Hi, Matthew Bernstein here. Lynn and I are partners at MC Bernstein Data. We run a small consulting firm which specializes in information governance, and we focus on specific risk and business objectives around privacy, records management, operational efficiency, e-discovery and regulatory readiness, contract compliance, things like that. My background and where Lynn and I started working together was at Deutsche Bank. In my last position there, I built and ran the global information governance function there. So had responsibility for records management, e-discovery operations, and enterprise archive solutions. So it's great to be here and doing this webinar with ActiveNav.
Okay, thanks for that. So here is our agenda for today. I'm going to kick us off with explaining why it really is a good idea to delete that junk data, which is stored across your corporate networks. Matthew and Lynn will then take a look at giving you some practical advice on how to start, the potential pitfalls to try and avoid, and best practices to follow for any data reduction or minimization effort. And we'll also be including some case study examples to show what can be achieved in the real world. And as noted, we expect the session to last around 30 or 40 minutes or so, and should leave plenty of time for questions that you may have at the end. Next slide. So just a few years ago, the concept of tens or hundreds of terabytes of content, let alone petabytes, being held on your corporate networks was a somewhat distant prospect, but increasingly this is becoming the norm. And the data footprint for all organizations continues to grow at a rapid rate. Or as Buzz Lightyear might say if he worked in IT, this data is going to infinity and beyond. So most organizations are really good at collecting, processing, and storing what is commonly called structured data within their line of business systems and databases. And these robust applications, by their very nature, lend themselves to having built-in data governance capabilities which can enforce adherence to corporate retention and information governance policies. But what we've also found is that organizations are even better at ignoring the data which is being stored outside of these database systems. This unstructured data, which might include collaborative office documents, emails, social media, blogs, images, videos, you name it, it's likely all out there on your network somewhere, and is typically held across a range of different data repositories, such as network file shares, SharePoint sites, Microsoft Exchange, personal drives, and increasingly in messaging applications like Teams or Slack. It really is a case of lots and lots of data, and this data being everywhere. So a recent Gartner market report estimated that this unstructured data represents over 80% of any organization's overall content. It's this unstructured data, or what we more appropriately refer to as dark data, which is typically unknown, unused, and often completely ignored, which is lurking on your corporate networks. And generally, it's this dark data that makes everything else less efficient. As the content grows at a very basic level, clearly this can lead to an increase in storage costs over time. Certainly when you factor in things like IT backup processes and the like, despite a general decrease in the raw cost of storage. It can also become, or it becomes more and more difficult for employees to find the content that they need as they search through all of this data, with the obvious impact on efficiency and productivity to find the right document. Or worse, users are basing business decisions on information which is out of date and maybe not from that master record. You're probably familiar with the term bootleg data. It's all those copies of master data which have been saved on a local drive, file share, or maybe in SharePoint by a business user for easy access outside of the control system. And if you're planning to migrate this data to a new system, and most of the companies we speak to are either already in the process or considering moving their data assets into the cloud, just doing a lift and shift and moving this junk data will not only inflate those initial data migration costs, but will also impact ongoing cloud subscription fees and other issues that we'll get into later regarding the junk data. It's like moving into a new house or an apartment. You really want to take the opportunity to clear out those closets filled with all the stuff that you've accumulated over the years and couldn't bear to part with at the time. But you really need to do it before you move, and it's the same with migration. But there are other problem areas to consider. Legal and e-discovery efforts are significantly increased. If you're having to run discovery for sensitive data related to a particular case across content which is over-retained well past its regulatory or business life, depending on the number of litigation or audit requests, just based on the cost of outside counsel review alone, this can lead to millions of dollars of avoidable legal costs every year. And as we have seen to get news of yet another data breach or ransomware attack almost on a daily basis, it seems recently, even more importantly, this dark data presents a real challenge because it also conceals all types of data privacy and regulatory compliance risks, with the increase of the chance of a security violation and the reputational damage to a company that can result in the event of a data breach or a hack. So this regulatory burden is increasing as well, which is being compounded with more punitive fines, which are being handed down by the regulators for non-compliance. And this can run into tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in some of the higher profile cases that you see out there. And further state regulations are in the process, similar to GDPR and CCPA, as well as a new federal data privacy policy being on the near horizon. And finally, just being able to show that you have conducted a well-defined data cleanup initiative, this can provide leverage and help show you that you've made good faith efforts to defend the company policy with the regulators when that inevitable data breach occurs. And similarly, this can also reduce cyber insurance policy costs, which are obviously on the rise at the minute, and help ensure that insurance claims are not going to be withheld by insurance companies for not taking precautions to protect and govern your data. Next slide, please. Okay, so with this chart, you can see a really useful way to picture how, with time, the value of information held in an organization decreases while the risks related to that information increases. The colors show the different types of information there on the left-hand side, such as office documents, product research, financial information, etc. And it really highlights that despite the different value that this information has to a business over time, you will see that after about 3 years, the risk to value gap keeps increasing across all types of data. So really the utility and benefit of this data reduces rapidly over time. And the report that I mentioned found that generally over a third of this data hasn't even been touched for over 3 years. So based on this, merely hitting the delete button to remove rot or redundant, obsolete, and trivial data and clear out this junk should really be a no-brainer, right? So Lynn, over to you.
Okay. So I'm sure everybody has heard the phrase, it's no one's problem, but everyone's problem. And that when does everyone's problem become nobody's responsibility? We see this time and time again in organizations where deleting of data, defensible disposition, which is so critical for all the things Andy mentioned, is something that everybody wants to do in the organization, but you really have to put a plan in place and you have to get the right people around the table. So typically what we've done, and we've been successful at this, is that first you have to have good policies. You can't start without really understanding what your policies are, whether that's the retention obligations, the regulatory drivers, the business obligations, et cetera. So you have to start with that. But then you also have to look at the risk and business priorities of the organization, because in order for you to be able to do this, you have to have all the critical components, which is the governance, the technology, the processes, et cetera. But you also have to have the right people around the table. And in order to do that, it really takes some factors to get them around the table to say, what's in it for me? What's important that stakeholders need to be at this table, and what are they going to get out of it? And you also know that most of these stakeholders have day jobs, and they know that this is not going to be an easy task to overcome. So what are the pain points? So I think, and I think everyone would agree with, is that if you put a good plan in place, you have some good policies that stand behind this, you could really start moving forward. One of the things that we've done is that you start small. You don't try to actually address this in large, buckets of data. You have to really decide where are the biggest risks and where is most of the data that you want to address, and start small. And if you can show some quick wins and some information to the leaders and the stakeholders that you actually can make success just doing some quick, reasonable steps, you get the wind in your back, and you could really actually start getting some more momentum in the organization.
So we'll talk about now some of the practical, following up on what Lynn said, talk about some of the specific things about how to start. So let's look at the next slide. So following up on what Lynn said, why is this so hard? One of the things is that everybody has an opinion, and everybody has different concerns, and many people want to be involved. And there are a number of risks that people are concerned about, not only the risks that people in the organization want to reduce, but when we talk about defensible disposal, people see the risk in that process. So it could be, are we disposing of data that we are required to retain from a legal point of view? Do we have tax matters? What happens if we have to look for it in the future? If we're going to dispose of data, how do we know that how do we know that the data we are disposing is securely disposed? What about personal information? So there's a lot of different things that people will raise as concerns and objections, and stakeholders will have interest. And in fact, you'll also have stakeholders who, or interested parties who may have, who may not see the benefit. We've kept everything forever. It hasn't been a problem. They may not see the risks and costs of the organization. And then lastly, you'll have people who say, this is just so complicated.
Right.
How do we do it? We can't possibly get started. And what we see a lot is situations where several years ago, organizations made a start. Perhaps they developed a policy, or they got a committee of folks together to make an effort to address the growth of data. And then that committee or working group quickly ran into a number of objections or problems or lack of responsibility, and immediately or very shortly shut down. So in order to avoid that, there are a couple of questions about what the approach is. And the first thing that you need to deal with is the fact that there is just so much data. And so some of the specific challenges are knowing who's responsible. So ultimately, when you engage in defensible disposal, you will have to talk to the data owners. Very rarely are you able to actually dispose of something, sort of on an in the background enterprise-wide approach. And you very often are going to have to find out who's responsible. And that's a challenge. Another big challenge is, and it sounds sort of silly, but it's true, that organizations don't know what it is when they have so much ungoverned data. So it's easy to think of it as the equivalent of boxes and boxes with no labels on them. So particularly when you get into big data stores and backup systems and email and file shares, where things have not been organized and it's difficult to know what it is, it seems daunting to be able to actually understand what the data is. Similarly, where it is, there are lots of applications and data stores that are typically attached to the network, and people will be uncertain as to where the data that is redundant, obsolete, and trivial, or old enough to be no longer useful and therefore can be disposed. They won't know where it's located. So those are sort of some basic issues, but the biggest problem is, even if you can understand what you've got and where it is, how do you approach it given the scale of the data? So what we've done is, and this goes back to something that Lynn said about how to get started. And if we look on the next slide, we could talk a little bit about that. So our recommendation is you're going to need to engage people with some cross-organizational responsibility in order to accomplish defensible disposal. You're certainly going to have to talk to people in legal. You're certainly going to have IT. You're going to have information security. Usually the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, is a critical participant in this. And so when you bring all those people together, this is not their first priority. Everybody has a priority, something other than this. Legal has a responsibility for managing certain risks of the company. They have responsibilities for e-discovery. Information security officers are often involved or even mandated with this defensible disposal, or with the idea that they should be reducing the amount of data in the organization. But to be fair, their responsibilities are usually around ID, access management, cyber risk management, data loss prevention. So when you get those folks and you want them to support the initiative, you've got to find some way of engaging with people who have limited time and limited awareness of these issues. So the best thing to do is not to try and solve all problems, not to try and meet all the objectives, and to start off identifying what's the critical objective that will make the most impact, make significant impact on the organization, bring a lot of value. Is it about mitigating risk? Is it about reducing costs? Is there a business opportunity? So what is it that you want to do? So if it's risk mitigation, let's say, could be, for instance, reducing the amount of PII, personally identifiable information, or other kinds of personal data. Or if you're a hospital system and you're concerned that you've got protected health information that may not be in your healthcare information management systems and may be resident in email systems or file shares, what is the objective? And not try and solve all objectives at once. That's the first thing, so that you can make the case. Second thing is, and this is probably the most important thing, where to focus the effort. So there are two dimensions to that question. What are the time frames that will be most important? Are you trying to remediate a legacy data store, or are you trying to put in place good practices going forward? Ultimately, you should be doing both. And if you are trying to do legacy data remediation, because, for instance, you're trying to dispose of a lot of data prior to migration, what's the period, what's the time frame you're going to focus on? And then tying that back to the critical objectives in terms of where you focus. So are you determining what to look at and make this a successful project by focusing on a specific business unit, and initially, let's say, to start, or a region, or a particular type of data, or a particular type of data store? So for instance, a certain set of file shares in a certain region. And that may sound not very ambitious, but you've got to test the operating model that you're putting in place. The people, the process, the technology, the governance to actually affect data disposal. So you need to choose, you need to be able to go to the business leaders and say, we're going to be focusing on this kind of data in this area for this period of time to achieve this risk. And that's our initial starting point. And that comes back to what Lynn said about achieving some quick wins. And the point of the quick wins is not just to get the wind at your back, although that's very important, but also to demonstrate that the process works. Because what we've seen in a lot of cases is people do develop information about what they have, but they don't have the process to then implement that actionable intelligence. And it's really, really important. We'll come to this later about what you need to have as a process for effective and defensible disposal. And then the last point in terms of getting started is not to assume that there's one part of the operating model that needs to be addressed right up front, and that's the cure-all for everything. So it's worth examining what you lack in order to execute defensible disposal. So you may have the information you need, but you may not have the right policies. You may not need an enterprise IT solution, meaning you may not need something that you're going to migrate all your data into in order to manage it. You can manage with systems and data stores that exist and apply good governance to them. So figure out what you're trying to achieve, what's critical, focus on an area that will meet that objective, and make sure you're delivering the right parts of the operating model. So we can move on to the next slide. And over to you, Andy.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. Yeah, so the basic framework for any successful remediation effort, we believe, contains three key components. The first is you have to be able to get visibility into the data to really know what you're dealing with before you can actually work on remediating it, so fairly obvious. The second is developing measuring sticks, the premise being if you don't measure it, you won't be able to track your performance over time. And thirdly, you need the ability to act on those metrics or outcomes that you've measured in order to actually see the benefit from the process. So next slide, thank you. Okay, so visibility. Well, this is really data discovery. And just to be clear, this is not legal process or the legal process which some of you may associate with the term discovery. This is really looking at trying to grab everything you can associated with your information. And sometimes you can get everything, but often there is very little information which may be based on the container or the repository the information is actually stored in, or it may have to do with the actual file type. A lot of firms have older files going back many, many years, maybe before some of you on the call were even born. And these files may offer up very little information apart from maybe knowing where it's stored in the file name. But you may then be able to get right into the content. So then you can run algorithms, regular expressions or rules, and do linguistic analysis to really try and get a feel for what the data is and what it's about. So basically you're grabbing file names, associating file attributes or metadata, opening up the file to further analyze the content, and then aiming to uncover as much context on the information as possible. So how do you do this? Well, you're going to need some software tools, that's for sure. But it's not just the tools. You also need people or subject matter experts, SMEs, who know the data and more importantly have time available, as well as policies and procedures and processes in place to be able to actually act on the data. So for a small data cleanup project, and by small I mean with quantities of data, something in the order of maybe 50,000 or 100,000 files. For this, you may already have tools available in-house which can reasonably address this amount of data. And assuming you have that SME with some time available, you may actually be able to do a good job to clean up your data, depending on the use cases or regulatory considerations that you may have within your organization. Next slide, please. However, when you're considering much larger data volumes, which we've been talking about here today, you'll need to find the right tool that's going to work for you. So by larger volumes, we're really talking about projects with upwards of 500,000 or millions of files, which equate to multi-terabytes of information. Those in-house tools will really only get you so far. And what you're going to find is that these will fall over quickly when you start looking to scale and run discovery across larger data sets with millions of files. You also likely fail with the connectivity required to actually access the data and gain that visibility that we were just talking about. So you need to be able to connect across all of the sources. And most importantly, you'll need to have the right software and experienced people to analyze the data and have the right workflow processes in place to then act on the data and allow your firm to get comfortable with actually hitting that delete button. So the market is very healthy and there are many options available which can provide some level of file analysis technology required. But there are also, it's fair to say, there are also lots of overlapping technologies out there. For example, many applications which are focused on cybersecurity or data loss prevention, for example, also provide some discovery capabilities, but they then may not be able to provide the ability to classify, tag, and then act on the data, as well as discovery applications, which might be a module or a component supplied with a content management suite, but also with similar limitations. So it's really important to understand what a particular tool can do and what it can't do. And I think it's fairly fair to say that unfortunately there isn't a silver bullet out there, which will provide a one-size-fits-all approach across file analysis and some of the other areas like cybersecurity, data loss prevention, etc., despite what it might say on the box. So this is where you really need to consider looking at a purpose-built file analysis tool in order to be successful with your data cleanup initiative. Clearly being a little less subjective here, but ActiveNav would certainly fit the bill as one of those best of breed file analysis solutions to seriously consider. Okay, so you've got visibility on your data, you have the metadata around the data, and you've extracted an understanding of the content based on where what it contains, and got some context on the information, maybe based on where it's stored. But you then need to develop your measuring sticks. Now, these are different ways of putting a classification onto a piece of data. It's really just data about the data. So if it's content, what is it? Is it an email? Is it a PowerPoint? Maybe it's an invoice. Just what is that content? But then there is security and confidentiality. Is it company IP? Maybe something which contains intellectual property, a strategic business plan, or maybe it's just a general marketing presentation. They should all have different security and confidentiality policies which need to be applied. And really, it's the same thing with the other measuring sticks, which can be applied for privacy, regulatory, and similarly with legal holds, etc. So when you're looking at a piece of data, you do need to apply all of the applicable measuring sticks to ensure it's being classified or labeled correctly to get it in line with your corporate policies. Next slide, please. So when you have your measuring sticks and data classifications defined, what then needs to happen is you need to convert these measuring sticks into rules that will fit and work within your file analysis tool that you've decided to use. So this would be the search terms for the content example or different parameters on the metadata. So applying these rules will now give you the data which is correctly categorized in line with your corporate policies. And it's then time to decide what you're going to do with that data. Now, this one area is where it is really important that you've selected the right file analysis tool, which has allowed you to effectively convert those measuring sticks into rules, being able to apply them to the data efficiently, but then also provides the workflow with supporting audit, with a supporting audit trail mechanism, and allows you to actually then act on this data. And this is where some solutions can fall short. So this session is really focused, as we said, on defensible deletion of data. So we're really looking at those last two actions, which are quarantine and delete. So the hardest part of this type of project is actually engaging the business and getting them to a place where they are comfortable with actually hitting the delete button. Rot data like redundant or duplicate files may be somewhat easier to deal with and maybe go ahead and delete without too much pain. But it's really the other data, which has, for example, has been classified using those measuring sticks as being outside of your corporate policy or regulatory retention requirements, where you'll need supporting workflow and a review process to actually get approval from the business to actually go ahead and delete. Now, this can be facilitated by initially putting that data identified into quarantine, where the action instead of delete is moving the data to a different controlled location for further review and approval before actually then going ahead and deleting the data. Another successful approach is to quarantine or move the data which has been classified as data which has no value or shouldn't really be kept by the organization. But instead of asking users for permission to do that deletion, you move the data and wait for the users to cry out, "Where's my data?" And from our experience, this rarely happens, as you might expect, considering the data which has no business value and has likely not been touched for many years. You're not going to get that call. But this approach does give you a window or a buffer to provide some comfort before you actually go ahead and defensively delete that data. Lynn, next slide.
Thank you. So we talked a lot about this, but this is a really important component to basically do this effectively. You need governance. And when you develop a policy and it tells you the what that you need to do for an organization through the creation and disposition of information, really just gives you a high level of what the rules are. It's really important to produce those procedures, document those procedures in a consistent, reasonable, and also effective way that businesses as well as the other stakeholders can understand it. Because it's not just IT or the business group's responsibility, it's everyone. It's the individuals, the employees in the organization that create the data. They need to really understand how they go through that life cycle. The other thing, and it has to be auditable. We say it's reasonable. We want to make sure that the users understand what their responsibilities are. It has to be consistent and transparent, particularly for the regulators and also the internal control functions that actually look at the processes to ensure that the company is staying compliant to the policies, but it has to be auditable. You have to have a consistent process. Legal has always told us that. That you define that process and you stay consistent to it, that's a good way of making sure that you're not going to, go into a different direction. I believe, even though we talked a lot about this, you have to start small. It's very hard to think about defensively disposing all information, particularly when we're talking about that the growth of this information is getting out of control in an organization. You have to look at what your risk and business objectives are, but it's not an ad hoc project. It's really a consistent program that the company needs to adopt. You have to have defensible operational strategies that everybody agrees to. You have to, as Andy said, have some innovative, highly automated technology to do this, because to defensively dispose manually, you'll never get to the end game. And then you absolutely have to have information governance oversight. When I've heard lots of times where the policy says that all employees, contractors, people who handle data are responsible for this. If you don't have a governance, especially, in addition to an operating committee, the senior leaders that are sponsoring this, if you don't have some governance that's sitting on top of this to really keep this going, it will always be a one-time situation. But when you think about it, people leave the organization, new people get hired, there's technology updates, processes changes due to business goals and objectives, and the controls are enhanced due to address the risks that the company faces. You have to have a sustainable program that provides ongoing support, guidance, and overall protection. So should I continue and just give an example of a case study that we did? So as you can see, this was a large multinational bank with multiple jurisdictions that they operated in, as well as over 80,000 people with branch offices. So we had an email with archive, with backup, and never deleting. Highly regulated organization, so it was a very complicated project, because you first needed to understand from the regulations of who in the organization needed to keep their emails for a certain amount of time. So you'd have to say, how do you actually ring fence that population before you deal with everybody else, which basically did not need to use email as a file cabinet, which is traditionally what happens. Everyone we talk to, people get very reliant on email as a look back, as a way of basically finding documents rather than scaling through the mounds of information and unstructured data. Legal, always, they look at email and they basically want to make sure that as long as we understand the legal holds and the information that can't be deleted, you've got to solve for that too. And then, as I said, multiple stakeholders, whether the businesses want to keep it for research purposes, business value, you have data governance groups saying that they are wanting to retain the data, as I said, for business value, et cetera. And you have to look at all of this holistically to make sure that you're meeting all of the challenges and all of the business objectives. But you absolutely can remove indefinite retention. So you look at the longest retention period that you think would be reasonable for the organization. You work with IT, you look back at as far as the email goes, you look at when it was the last modified or accessed, and you start putting processes in place that would help. We typically would do it over the course of 1 or 2 years because the cultural issue of changing the mindset as well as the behaviors of the organization should not be underestimated. That's a really big challenge that most organizations have. But you also put a business case together. When you see what the storage of the, most companies are backing up 4 different times and then backing up to tapes that sit in archives that are losing value. The storage costs, even though they say storage is cheap, it just ramps up, and you can actually put that business case together, as well as e-discovery. If you look at the legal fees associated with just pulling all of these costs, all of this data, and then going through all of that, it goes into the millions of dollars. And then lastly, I'm sure everybody has witnessed this, those smoking gun emails that you just wish you never were able to find. And then, of course, what everybody's dealing with today, PII. You need to make sure that you get rid of the data, and you certainly don't want PII sitting in your emails. So we did this. We put this program together. It didn't take overnight, but we basically stayed the course. And we were able to implement retention, and we were able to actually show that we could start deleting a tremendous amount of data from legacy data. So it works. I could attest to that. Oh, you're on mute, Andy.
Yeah, I was on mute. Thank you. Okay, here's another real-world example of an organization who have benefited from a data minimization or cleanup initiative. And this time from it's an energy utility company who we've been working with for a number of years now. So Spire Energy are based out of St. Louis, Missouri, and provide natural gas utilities to over 1.7 million customers across Alabama, Mississippi, and Missouri. So they operate in a highly regulated industry with safety and environmental concerns being high on their priorities. Similar to many firms in the energy industry, they have grown through acquisitions over time, and as a result have accumulated a significant amount of data with these acquisitions. And this, coupled with the general ongoing day-to-day growth in their unstructured data, which we've mentioned, had resulted in them giving them really a limited view or visibility of their data, and made documents really difficult to find for their employees across their various business units. So following a successful pilot project to the stakeholders across multiple departments, using the ActiveNav file analysis solution, they were able to quickly run discovery and build an inventory of their unstructured data held across their various repositories, which similarly included file shares, SharePoint, but also OpenText. And the application was then applied to defensibly delete the rot data that they identified. So having removed significant amounts of that rot data, they were then able to use the application to classify and tag the remaining good data to better organize the content, and in doing so, enable their users to actually quickly find that correct information with the obvious benefits on productivity as a result. So the solution is also providing other benefits. The legal department leveraged the application to discover, identify, and tag information against specific criteria using the rules capability for supporting e-discovery requests, which Lynn just mentioned in the other example, and applying legal holds in a more timely manner as well. So, and now a few years into this project, Spire are now actually in the process of leveraging the application for ongoing data governance to keep their data clean. Now they've cleaned it up, but also applying data classifications, those measuring sticks again, to prepare and facilitate migrating data into Microsoft 365 cloud. So the initial data discovery and ROC remediation was really only the start of their journey. Next slide, please. So this slide outlines that journey, how that typical journey looks for many of our customers. And as the strapline says, you cannot manage what you don't know you have, which is very true, of course. So that initial data discovery and building an inventory of your data to allow you to gain an understanding of the content that you hold is, as we've said, the all-important first step for any data minimization effort. And then by leveraging the best practice highlighted by Matthew and Lynn, this will then certainly put you on the path towards implementing a broader information governance program. Next slide, please. Okay, so just quickly a little more about ActiveNav. We are based out of Reston, Virginia, and have over 65 employees supporting our customers and partners, big and small, across federal government, both DoD and civilian agencies, state and local government, and also commercial customers in highly regulated industries like the financial services and energy customers that we just highlighted. And through our professional services team, we have tens of thousands of hours of real-world experience solving these data issues. And our proven software has literally indexed billions of files over the years. So our solutions are very much focused on shining a light on the ever-increasing mountains of data that organizations are struggling with. And our company's North Star is helping those organizations that we work with try and get to a state of zero dark data. And ultimately, when they go on this journey with us, be in a position to ignore exactly 0 bytes of their data in the future. Lynn, next slide.
I'll pick this up.
Okay.
So, you know, we work with ActiveNav and with other technology providers, but we look at what is it that we deliver to our clients. So the first thing is to assess their IG operating framework. So what do we mean by that? We have a comprehensive view of what's required for information governance. We're not technology providers, we're not lawyers, but we have a knowledge of all aspects of the operating model necessary for good information governance. So what are the requirements from a people, a governance, procedure, and a technology point of view? Because one of the things we find when we make assessments for our clients is that there are gaps in capabilities. So they may have a records management program, for instance, with policies, but they don't necessarily have the operating capabilities to carry those out. Sometimes they have a risk framework with controls, but they haven't identified where their data lines up against those controls. So our goal is to bridge that gap between policy and control with the operating capabilities that are necessary to really put information governance into place. And we do that by bringing leadership to the bear for our clients, folks in our team who've done this in industry, banking, and elsewhere. And so when we design solutions to create these operating capabilities, we're bringing a deep operating experience. And that includes not only those capabilities, but what are the responsibilities and what communication is necessary throughout the organization to create that complete operating model. And lastly, we talk about performance. So this is the idea that it's not, as Lynn said, our goal is not to have a one-time clean up the data solution. And as Andy has talked about also, their customers continuing to use their solution so that we maintain those information governance objectives over time. Sustainable performance, not one-time effort. So that's what we do.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andy, Lynn, and Matthew. And on to our questions. We'll start with one from Susan. Has the disposition of records during the pandemic increased, decreased, or stayed the same? What is the impact there? Matthew, back over to you to start.
So I would say, maybe surprisingly, I don't know, I think it's actually increased. And I honestly don't know whether it's the pandemic or it's just the passage of time over the last couple of years. But I would say that the combination of privacy becoming an increasingly important concern and the realization through the pandemic of just how many different platforms people use to communicate and share information and how many places it's stored has caused our clients, the companies we talk to realize that they do need to bring some governance to, particularly to their unstructured data, as Andy described at the beginning of this. So I think it's increased, but I think it's a trend, not just a point in time.
Yeah. And if I may add to that, I think I saw the question even related to paper. And to Matthew's point, I do believe paper has decreased because everybody is working remotely and they don't have the opportunity to print out and store paper, which is a good thing, but then that increases the electronic storage. So I do think they go hand in hand, and the positive of decreasing paper, because a lot of times you don't have to have paper, but that's just, a way that people like to work, has decreased.
Fantastic, thank you for that. So it was mentioned during the presentation that having buy-in is important. Do you have any specific tips for getting that senior level buy-in, especially when it comes to getting resources and getting evangelists on board for these types of projects?
Well, I think I'll take a first pass at that. I think we touched on it during the presentation, but one approach similar to what Spire Energy did, which was one of the case studies, is to run a small proof of concept against a sample data set of your own data to address maybe a primary use case, and then use the results that you get from that exercise, which is based around your own data, to present that to the primary stakeholders. And this will provide a set of metrics, which is again based on your own data, and it has a lot more value when you can see your own data. For example, an inventory showing what ROT data you might have across your organization. That is always an eye-opener when we go through these type of processes. And that can then be extrapolated across the full data footprint that you have across that organization. And it will help feed into that business case justification and really help to get the buy-in from the stakeholders. That's what we find in our experience.
I would also say for senior sponsorship, sometimes you want to address it in a more strategic way, but as you're defining what the pain points or what the drivers are in why you want to do this, you can't just hand the problem over to the senior leaders to try to solve, because sponsorship doesn't mean that they own the problem. So you really have to have a collaborative conversation to say, if we do this, this is how we will help the company. This is how we will help the workforce. This is how we will save money. This is how we'll reduce risk. And this is how we will do it. Lots of times strategy doesn't show the operational components of how to go about doing it. But if you can speak to senior leaders in just a practical, no nonsense way and say, to your point, Andy, trust me, and we'll show you. We will show you how we can do this, but give us the opportunity, because in the long run, it will help the company overall. It's received very well.
And I would just add that we rarely have conversations about information governance in general. It's always about it's usually triggered by some external or internal threat. So sometimes it's very obvious. It's a regulatory enforcement action. The company's been told, we're working with a client now, FTC has come in and said you need to do a better job of governing the personal data of your clients, and they have to respond. In other cases, they're doing business in New York and they've realized that the new New York State Shield Act, which is an outgrowth of the New York State Department of Financial Services, that they have to respond to that. So there's a variety of things that are either present or looming that make them realize that someone in the organization has realized needs to be addressed. And that can be the catalyst, and usually is the catalyst, to be able to explain to senior management why you need to do this, which then opens up the conversation about the other benefits.
Fantastic. So we'll wrap with this question. Do you have any tips for successfully making and implementing changes to pre-existing governance or retention policies in a way that causes the least disruption and the most cooperation? So that's a loaded question there.
So I think Lynn has some great answers to this. I'm going to put you on the spot because, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when I say it, there's a tendency to overcomplicate retention. And Lynn, you're shaking your head, you're nodding your head, because the more complicated it is, people feel like, oh, we'll be 3 years in Brazil and we'll be 5 years here, we'll be 2 years there, and then nothing gets done, because who can maintain that level of organizational, that kind of policy complexity creates organizational operational difficulty. And since nobody, it's like if you throw something out after 3 years, what, rather than 5 years, how much benefit have you gained in comparison, thinking you're going to do that, in comparison to saying we're going to keep everything for 5 years or 7 years, and then we're actually going to act on it. So Lynn, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just as Matthew said, you've got to make it practical, because if it's too complicated, it's hard to operationalize. Policies aren't static. When you develop a policy, as I said earlier, things change. You always have to look at the policy. You have to look at the operational procedures, what works for the business that you're supporting. And again, if it's easy to interpret, if you're there helping the organization understand how to go about doing it, and the retention, we see this all the time. You want to actually put the longest retention, and it differs with data types too. How you're going to apply a policy on email versus how are you going to apply retention on unstructured data like file shares, or how are you going to apply that to the migration to a document management system, or how are you going to look at it from an application standpoint and understanding the workflow processes. You just have to roll up your sleeves and just get a little bit more understanding the data, where it is, where it's flowing, and then you document those policies and procedures so that it's actionable and it's operational and people understand what their responsibility is on how to go about doing it. But don't try to boil the ocean all at once. You really should disaggregate those small little projects and then show that you could really actually make some good progress.
Absolutely. Well, to our panelists, thank you for all of your insights and your tips today. To our attendees, thank you. If you have any questions for our panelists, their contact information is up on the screen, but we will wrap there. We appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.